Something crazy coming out of California. Is this unusual hearing something crazy coming out of California? Maybe not. But do you remember the scare in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s about the AIDS epidemic, the HIV scare? Did you know that the narrative was actually a lie? We were not all vulnerable to this. The whole scare of what the AIDS epidemic was, it didn't actually apply to 99 point, I don't know, at least 99% of the population, because they were not intravenous drug users, they were not engaging in other risky behaviors. So the AIDS epidemic, it was actually a narrative. It is a narrative being pushed by a whole bunch of groups. And in some ways, this whole big narrative was a strange social push. And I think it was designed to lessen individual responsibility. And in some ways, there's something that's recently come out of California that's a whole nother level of this type of thing. So in a rush to stupidity, California has recently lowered the criminal punishment of purposefully transmitting HIV from a felony to just a misdemeanor. I call that insane. And so just for those who don't know too well, HIV is a disease that significantly lessens life expectancy, quality of life, and dooms a person to the perpetual dependence on pharmaceuticals. So it's actually a very large business. It's millions, probably billions of dollars around the world. And so now in California, even purposefully giving tainted blood to blood banks is now just a minor crime, sort of like graffiti under a bridge. It's a misdemeanor. It's nothing very special. And so that sounds insane. Feels wrong, unfair. It subjects everyone else not involved in their risky behaviors. It's a blood bank, you need blood, you go to a hospital. In California, there's now a lot more risk than there used to be. So I want to ask a small question. Is our world just? How much of the news makes us think, now that is justice? When we hear all the negative stories, or even some of the positive ones, how much do we think to ourselves, now that is justice? And when we do have that rare occasion when we say, that is justice, was it spurred on by our justice system, something that came through the courts? Or was it just something that happened? Was it something in nature? Was it someone got their just desserts and it felt right, it felt just? In some ways, we might call it karma. But why would we call it karma? We're not after the practice or the traditions of Eastern religious philosophies. That's not our perspective from the West. And yet, one of the fastest things we'll think about when someone gets what they deserve is we call it karma. We have many TV shows, books, all sorts of modern media, and they deal with this concept of getting vengeance, of getting what's right, of having the bad guys get it in the neck, because the law is failing. We have all these vigilantes, we have superheroes. Why? Because the law is failing. And we have vigilantes in these superhero storylines, and essentially they're our modern myths, our modern Hercules or Zeuses, that people kind of adore and put their hopes in, and the dreams, and it captures a lot of people. But these vigilantes, we feel there's some justice in them going outside of the law and getting what's right. So I think by nature we know there's something wrong with our laws. there's something wrong with our judgments, there's something wrong with a system, our justice system, we call it more correctly a legal system, because it's not really just a lot of the time. And maybe this is because society has maligned one of its biggest foundations. If we go to Matthew 23, verse 23, we have one of the most famous of scriptures, and it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You pay tithes of mint, dill, and cumin, but you disregard the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith." You've practiced the latter, the small things, yet without neglecting the former, you... Oh, never mind. Just totally read that wrong. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. So these people, these scribes, these Pharisees, these hypocrites, they have forgotten the weightier matters and cared about the small pieces of the law, which they should have still kept, but they missed the whole point of justice, mercy, and faithfulness, or faith. If we look at society right now, I think that's probably more true than it's ever been. We don't care so much about our justice. Our mercy is rare. And faith, we've crushed faith. Faith is a dirty word in a lot of modern society. Our system protects predators. It hides dastardly things beneath the carpets of society, and has so many laws that the innocent are often convicted while the guilty remain free. And to me, it seems that it's all because we have rejected God's law and the weightier matters, justice, mercy, and faith. In some ways, you can just look at the US tax code. It's amazingly predicted to grow to over 100,000 pages of statutes and clauses by 2050. This is just the tax code, 100,000 pages. That's more than the Bible by many times over. These small things, they have regarded the tiny things. Taxing mint, dill, and cumin wouldn't be enough for our secular scribes and Pharisees. They want to tax the rain. They want to make it, in some states they've already started, they make it illegal to capture rain. They want to own the air. We breathe CO2. What's the big push right now? It's all about CO2 control. And if things go their way, I would wonder, would they try and tax how much we breathe? You're a white male. How much is your privilege? Well, you breathing our air, the state's air, they own all the air. How much would they charge you? Is there going to be some sort of strange privilege tax, breathing tax? In some ways, things are so ridiculous when you can have 100,000 pages of laws that I don't really doubt it's possible they could do something so stupid and invasive. So I'd say this is oppression, this is excessive control, this is micromanagement at the highest level, and maybe even slavery. How much freer were the serfs in past times than now? Our land is taxed, our income is taxed. We are renting the land from the state. We don't have inheritance like the laws of Israel, where the land was a family's land. The state had no ownership over it, at least under a righteous king. Israel failed more than it succeeded, but they had the standards. So I can't really help but wonder, where did it all go wrong? Our laws allow for a lot of heinous things. It allows for abortion. And our justice is often blind to the victimization of the weak and the powerless. our safety nets, all of the orphans, where do they go? There have been so many abuses that have been talked about. But I want to just turn to Leviticus 19, verse 14. God has a lot of things to say about justice and judgment. In Leviticus 19, we could read the whole chapter, but that would take too long. So we'll just go to verse 14. You shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. And if you continue reading the whole chapter, you'll see that most of the statements end with, I am the Lord. Every act, every command, every piece of justice and equity is commanded by God's authority. So our society, we reject God's authority, we reject the basis and the legitimacy of some of these basic things like justice, mercy, and faith. And since this is just a sermonette, and you could talk at length to become, you could have a whole series on justice. Justice is that deep of a concept. It is one of the founding blocks to our belief, to God's way of life, to the foundation of how the world is established. You could go on and on and on about justice, but let's just go to Psalm 96 and verse 10. Remember, in Leviticus 19, it says, I am the Lord at the end. And so in Psalm 96, verse 10, it says, say among the nation, the Lord reigns. So the Lord's come. The I am the Lord, the authority comes and says, say to the nations, the Lord reigns, the world is also firmly established, it shall not be moved. He shall judge the peoples righteously. Let the heavens rejoice, let the earth be glad, let the sea roar and all its fullness. Let the field be joyful and all that is in it. Then all the trees of the wood will rejoice before the Lord, for he is coming to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with his truth. I like the very last word, his truth. In our world we have many truths. And here there's one truth, his truth. But he's coming to judge the earth. In Psalm 98, just 2 chapters ahead, verse 7, it echoes the same sentiment. Let the sea roar and all its fullness, the world and those who dwell in it. Let the rivers clap their hands, let the hills be joyful together before the Lord. For he is coming to judge the earth with righteousness, he shall judge the world and the peoples with equity. Of course, if you study the day of the Lord, the hills are joyful. There are other descriptions, like the hills, are dancing like deer or rams. This vision of earthquakes that are kind of unimaginable in terms of scope and power. But you think of this, nature is going to be glad that God comes, even with the destruction. Things are getting so unnatural. They're moving so far away from the natural ways that God built into nature that nature is going to rejoice. The rivers are going to rejoice. These are inanimate things. We're personifying them here, but they're going to rejoice. If we go to Micah 4 and verse 1, it says, and it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob." And what's the point? What's the point? And he will teach us about his ways, that we may walk in his paths. People won't know. What are the ways? Why do we have our problems? Why do we have injustice? Why do we have stupidity? You know, our leaders doing things that will not help the people, because they do not know the way. And he will teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, and he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. So Christ is coming. I could have cited the scriptures about Christ being given all authority to judge. I could have been given scriptures about the Father and all the ways that he's raised Christ up in order to be a king, in order to rule during the millennium. But in the simplest way, the greatest difference between our age and the coming age is simply justice will reign.